I thought paying for my granddaughter's wedding would earn me a seat with my family. I never imagined it would earn me a label. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the ballroom. The seating chart stood near the entrance, framed in white roses and soft golden lights. Guests gathered around it, smiling as they searched for their names. At 68 years old, I had been looking forward to this day for over a year. I adjusted my pearl necklace and looked for my name. Margaret Collins. Instead of seeing grandmother, the words beside me read, wedding sponsor. My stomach dropped. Not grandmother. Not family. Sponsor. The ballroom was beautiful, crystal chandeliers sparkled, a string quartet played softly, Emily waited at her table in a radiant white dress. But beside my name sat strangers. Business acquaintances of the groom's parents. A distant neighbor. Someone from the country club. I stood there silently while guests moved around me. Something about this felt wrong. Then Emily's cheerful voice broke through my thoughts. My granddaughter Emily was getting married, and I had done everything I could to help make her dream wedding come true. I adjusted the pearl necklace my late husband had given me on our 30th anniversary and walked toward the display. The ballroom was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. A string quartet played softly in the background. Everything looked exactly the way Emily had described it during our countless planning conversations. For a moment, I felt proud. Proud that I could help. Proud that my husband's hard work had allowed me to contribute to something so meaningful. Then I found my name. Margaret Collins. I expected to see it listed beneath a table near Emily and the rest of the family. Instead, beside my name were two words that made my stomach drop. Wedding sponsor. Not grandmother. Not family. Sponsor. As if I were a corporation writing a check. As if my role in Emily's life could be reduced to a financial contribution. I blinked several times, convinced I had misunderstood. Then I looked again. There it was. Margaret Collins. Wedding sponsor. Table 18. I followed the chart with my finger until I found the table assignment. It sat near the back corner of the ballroom, far from the dance floor, far from the family tables, far from the bridal party. I stood there silently while guests moved around me. A young couple glanced at the chart and then at me before quickly looking away. Their expressions told me I wasn't imagining things. Something about this felt wrong. Grandma. Emily's cheerful voice broke through my thoughts. She hurried toward me in her wedding robe, her makeup already perfect despite the busy morning. She hugged me tightly. You look beautiful, I told her honestly. Today is going to be wonderful. She smiled and thanked me before being pulled away by a photographer. The moment passed quickly. Too quickly for me to ask the question forming in my mind. Did she know? I told myself not to overthink it. Weddings were stressful. Details got mixed up. Someone probably made a mistake. Still, as I walked toward table 18, a strange heaviness settled inside my chest. I remembered the months of planning. The venue deposits. The florist. The catering upgrades. The live band Emily had fallen in love with after hearing them perform at another wedding. Every time costs increased, I quietly covered the difference. Not because anyone demanded it. Because I loved her. Because family mattered. At least, I thought it did. When I reached my table, the feeling only grew stronger. The people seated there were strangers. Business acquaintances of the groom's parents. A distant neighbor. Someone from the country club. Nice people, certainly, but not family. Not one familiar face sat nearby. I looked across the ballroom toward the front tables. Richard, my son, laughed with a group of relatives. Pamela, my daughter-in-law, stood confidently beside him, directing staff members with the ease of someone completely in control. She looked toward me briefly. Just for a second. Then she smiled and turned away. It was a small moment. Tiny, really. But something about that smile lingered in my mind. The ceremony had not even started, yet I suddenly felt like a guest at someone else's celebration. As I lowered myself into my chair and stared once more at the words printed beside my name, one unsettling question refused to leave me. If I was only the sponsor, then who exactly had taken my place in the family? I sat at that table for several minutes pretending to study the menu card while memories kept drifting through my mind. It was strange how quickly a person could feel invisible in a room filled with hundreds of people. The servers moved gracefully between tables. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. Somewhere across the ballroom, Emily was taking photographs with her bridesmaids. Everything looked perfect. Yet I could not stop staring at the words printed beside my name. Wedding sponsor. I had not come here expecting recognition. I never needed applause. But I had hoped to be treated like family. The truth was that none of this would have happened without Emily. She was the reason I had opened my heart and my checkbook. When she was 8 years old, she used to spend entire weekends at my house. We baked cookies together. We watched old movies on rainy afternoons. After my husband passed away, she became the bright spot in many difficult years. Every birthday card arrived on time. Every holiday included a phone call. Even when she left for college, she still found time to visit. At least that was how things used to be. When she became engaged 18 months earlier, she had driven to my house with tears in her eyes and a diamond ring sparkling on her finger. I could still hear her voice. "Grandma, I wanted you to be the first person to know." We sat at my kitchen table for nearly 3 hours that day talking about venues, flowers, dresses, and dreams. She showed me photographs on her phone. She described the kind of wedding she had always imagined. A beautiful ballroom. Live music. Elegant decorations. A celebration that would bring everyone together. I remember smiling as I listened. Then she hesitated. The excitement faded from her face for just a moment. She admitted that the budget was becoming overwhelming. Prices were higher than expected. The venue she loved was beyond reach. I looked at her and saw the same little girl who used to fall asleep on my couch with a blanket tucked under her chin. So I made a decision. I told her not to worry. I told her that her grandfather and I had spent our lives saving carefully. If I could help create a special memory for her, then that was exactly what I wanted to do. At first, I offered to cover the venue. Then the florist. Then the catering upgrades. Every few weeks another expense appeared. Every time, I quietly handled it. Emily always thanked me. She hugged me. She called me her angel. More than once she told people that she could not imagine her wedding without me. Those words meant more than any receipt. Looking back now, I realized something had slowly changed during the planning process. Most of my conversations shifted from Emily to Pamela. Questions started being answered by Pamela. Decisions started being approved by Pamela. Meetings happened without me. When I offered suggestions, Pamela smiled politely and explained that everything was already under control. I ignored the feeling because I wanted peace. I convinced myself that weddings were stressful and families occasionally became complicated. But sitting there at table 18, I began replaying dozens of small moments that had never felt quite right. The more I thought about them, the less accidental they seemed. Across the ballroom, Pamela stood near the head table speaking with the event coordinator. She looked confident and comfortable, as though every detail had unfolded exactly as planned. Then she glanced toward my table once again. This time our eyes met for a brief second. Her smile remained perfectly pleasant. Yet something about it sent a chill through me. For the first time all day, I found myself wondering whether the seating chart was not a mistake at all. The ceremony began a few minutes later, giving me an excuse to stop thinking and simply observe. Everyone stood as the music started. Emily appeared at the far end of the aisle, radiant and smiling, and for a moment all of my concerns faded into the background. She looked happy. That was what mattered, I told myself. That was why I had done all of this. I watched guests dab tears from their eyes. I listened as promises were exchanged. I applauded when the ceremony ended and the room filled with cheers. Outwardly, everything was exactly as it should have been. Yet underneath that beautiful surface, a quiet uneasiness continued to grow. During the cocktail hour, I wandered through the ballroom studying details I had helped pay for. The floral arrangements were even more impressive than the photographs. Hundreds of white roses filled the room. The crystal centerpieces reflected the light like tiny stars. Every element matched the vision Emily had once described at my kitchen table. Several guests approached me to compliment the wedding. A few thanked me for helping make the day possible. One elderly couple even assumed I was sitting with the immediate family because, as the woman put it, a grandmother like you belongs at the center of everything. I smiled politely and changed the subject. I did not know how to explain that I was seated farther away than most of the groom's co-workers. As the reception began, another detail caught my attention. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and thanked various people who had contributed to the event. He acknowledged the bride's parents. He praised the groom's family. Then he thanked our generous wedding sponsor, Margaret Collins. Several heads turned toward me. A spotlight briefly passed across my table. People clapped politely. I forced a smile. Sponsor. There was that word again. Not grandmother. Not beloved family member. Sponsor. The distinction seemed small, but it felt enormous. The applause faded, and conversations resumed. Across the room, I noticed Richard laughing with relatives I had not seen in years. They occupied one of the prime tables directly beside the dance floor. Pamela sat among them looking completely satisfied. She raised her glass during a toast and accepted compliments from guests as though she had personally orchestrated every detail. I tried not to judge. I tried not to let suspicion cloud my thinking. Still, I could not ignore the pattern forming in front of me. The evening continued. Dinner was served. Music filled the ballroom. Yet I realized that nobody from my own family had come to sit with me for more than a few moments. Emily was understandably busy. Newly married couples always are. But Richard never stopped by. Pamela certainly did not. Even relatives who normally greeted me warmly seemed oddly distant, as though an invisible line had been drawn through the room. Then something unexpected happened. A man stopped beside my table and introduced himself. His name was Martin Hayes. He looked to be in his early 70s and carried himself with quiet confidence. I recognized him after a moment. He had worked with my late husband years ago. We exchanged pleasantries and spoke about old times. Then his expression shifted slightly. He glanced toward the seating chart still visible from across the ballroom entrance. "Margaret," he said carefully, "forgive me if I am overstepping, but are you happy with where they placed you?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering. "Why do you ask?" Martin studied the room for a second before looking back at me. "Because I have attended a lot of weddings," he said quietly, "and I have never seen the person who made the entire celebration possible treated quite like this." His words settled heavily in my chest. For the first time that evening, I realized I was not the only one who had noticed. After Martin returned to his table, I found myself paying closer attention to everything around me. Once a question takes root in your mind, it changes the way you see the world. Suddenly, details that seemed harmless before begin connecting themselves into a larger picture. I sat quietly while dinner continued, watching conversations flow around the room. The more I observed, the more I noticed that Pamela seemed to be everywhere. She directed servers. She adjusted seating arrangements. She whispered instructions to vendors. People approached her constantly, treating her as the unquestioned authority over the entire event. That alone was not unusual. Mothers of brides often become deeply involved in weddings. What bothered me was how familiar the pattern felt. Over the past year, Pamela had gradually positioned herself between me and nearly every important decision. At the time, I told myself it was practical. Looking back, it felt different. I remembered one afternoon 6 months earlier when Emily and I were reviewing venue options together. We had narrowed the list down to 2 locations. Emily seemed excited about both. Then Pamela arrived unexpectedly. Within 20 minutes, the conversation was over. The choice had been made. Not by Emily. Not by me. By Pamela. Similar moments followed throughout the planning process. Guest lists changed. Budgets expanded. Vendors appeared without discussion. Whenever I asked questions, Pamela always had an answer prepared. Always polite. Always smiling. Always making me feel as though I was worrying unnecessarily. At the time, I admired her confidence. Now I wondered whether confidence had simply made it easier to control the narrative. Across the ballroom, the newlyweds began making their way from table to table greeting guests. Everyone seemed delighted to see them. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed across the room. Emily looked genuinely happy. That fact continued to complicate everything. If she had intentionally treated me this way, I could not understand why. The girl I knew would never have wanted to hurt me. Yet the evidence sitting in front of me suggested otherwise. My name had not accidentally ended up on that seating chart. The repeated use of the word sponsor could not be coincidence. Somebody had made those decisions. Somebody wanted me viewed a certain way. As I wrestled with those thoughts, another memory surfaced. 3 months before the wedding, Emily had called me late one evening. She sounded exhausted. We talked for nearly an hour. At one point she admitted that planning had become overwhelming. She laughed and said she felt like she was no longer making decisions about her own wedding. I remembered asking what she meant. There was a long pause. Then she changed the subject. At the time I assumed she was simply stressed. Now that conversation felt important. Before I could think further, Richard finally approached my table. It was the first real conversation we had shared all evening. He smiled, squeezed my shoulder, and thanked me again for everything I had done. His words sounded sincere. Yet something was missing. He never mentioned the seating arrangement. Never mentioned the introductions. Never asked whether I was comfortable. The omissions felt louder than anything he actually said. After a few minutes he excused himself and returned to the family tables near the front of the room. I watched him leave. A strange sadness settled over me. Richard had always been a good son. Not perfect, but kind. Yet tonight he seemed content to accept whatever version of events Pamela had created. As the band began playing the first dance song, I glanced toward the entrance where the seating chart still stood illuminated beneath soft lights. Guests no longer gathered around it. Most had forgotten it existed. But I had not. Because the more I thought about it, the less it resembled a simple sign and the more it felt like a message. And I was beginning to suspect that the message had been intended for me all along. The evening moved forward, but my attention no longer belonged to the music, the speeches, or the celebration unfolding around me. It belonged to the growing feeling that something important had been hidden in plain sight. As the dance floor filled with guests, I remained at my table watching the room carefully. Sometimes the truth does not arrive in a dramatic moment. Sometimes it reveals itself through 100 small details that suddenly begin fitting together. A little later, Martin returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me and sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the reception continue. Finally, he leaned slightly closer. "Margaret, may I ask you something?" I nodded. "Did Emily personally ask you to cover most of these wedding expenses?" The question surprised me. "Of course," I said. "At least at the beginning." Martin seemed thoughtful. "At the beginning?" I explained how the planning had evolved over time. How conversations gradually shifted away from Emily and toward Pamela. How invoices started arriving through Pamela. How decisions increasingly passed through Pamela before reaching anyone else. Martin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he stared into his coffee for a moment. Interesting, he said quietly. Very interesting. I asked him what he meant. He hesitated. Perhaps. Nothing. But I have known families for a long time. When people start controlling information, they are usually protecting something. His words lingered with me long after he left. A short time later, I excused myself and walked toward the hallway near the restrooms. I needed a few minutes away from the noise. The corridor was quieter than the ballroom. The music became distant. For the first time all evening, I could hear my own thoughts. As I rounded a corner, I recognized Pamela's voice. She was standing near a service entrance speaking with two women I did not know. I had no intention of listening. In fact, I started to walk away immediately. Then I heard my name. I froze. Honestly, Pamela said with a soft laugh, she loves feeling important. Giving her the sponsor title was perfect. The women chuckled politely. My heart sank. Pamela continued. If we called her grandmother of the bride all night, she would think the wedding was about her. This way everyone understands what her role actually was. Nobody noticed me standing around the corner. I remained completely still. One of the women asked whether I minded the arrangement. Pamela shrugged. She will survive. Besides, the important guests are at the front. The conversation moved on to another topic, but I had already heard enough. The words were not loud. They were not cruel in the dramatic way people imagine cruelty. That was what made them hurt. They were casual. Dismissive. As though reducing my entire relationship with Emily to a financial transaction was perfectly reasonable. I quietly stepped away before anyone could see me. My hands trembled slightly as I returned to the ballroom. Not from anger. From clarity. For most of the evening, I had been questioning myself. Wondering whether I was being sensitive. Wondering whether I had misunderstood. Now those doubts began disappearing one by one. I returned to my table and sat down. Across the room, Pamela smiled and laughed with guests, completely unaware that I had overheard her conversation. The strange thing was that I did not feel the urge to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. Did Emily know? Because if Pamela had acted alone, then there was still something worth saving. But if Emily had agreed with her, then the situation was far more painful than I had imagined. As the band began another song and guests flooded the dance floor once again, I looked toward the head table where my granddaughter sat beside her new husband. She looked happy. She looked proud. And for the first time all night, I realized I needed answers before I made any decisions about what came next. The reception continued well into the evening, but something inside me had changed after hearing Pamela's conversation. Before that moment, I had been searching for explanations. Now I was searching for facts. There is a difference. Explanations often comfort us. Facts rarely do. I remained calm. Years of life had taught me that emotional decisions usually create larger problems. If I wanted to understand what was really happening, I needed patience. Fortunately, patience had always been one of my strengths. Near the end of the evening, guests began gathering around the dance floor for the final celebrations. Emily and her husband looked exhausted but happy. Friends surrounded them. Family members lined up to offer congratulations. I watched from a distance, still uncertain whether Emily knew about the decisions Pamela had made. The question lingered in my mind like an unfinished sentence. Then an opportunity appeared unexpectedly. Emily stepped away from the crowd for a moment and headed toward a quieter hallway near the bridal suite. For the first time all day, she was alone. I followed at a comfortable pace and gently called her name. She turned immediately and smiled. The warmth in her expression looked genuine. "Grandma," she said, wrapping her arms around me. "I have barely had a chance to talk to you all day." We stood together for a few moments. I told her how beautiful the ceremony had been. She thanked me again for everything I had done. Then I asked a simple question. Emily, can I ask you something? Of course. Who decided on the seating chart? For a brief second, confusion crossed her face. Not guilt. Not defensiveness. Confusion. The seating chart, she repeated. Yes. I do. Not no. Pamela and the coordinator handled most of that during the final month. My heart beat a little faster. Did you ask for me to be listed as wedding sponsor? Emily stared at me. What are you talking about? I explained what had been printed beside my name and where I had been seated. As I spoke, her expression changed completely. The color drained from her face. Grandma, no. She shook her head immediately. No, I would never do that. Her reaction was so immediate and sincere that I believed her. She looked genuinely upset. I thought you were sitting at the family table, she said quietly. I specifically requested that months ago. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence carried more meaning than words. Finally Emily sighed. I knew Pamela changed some things near the end, but I did not realize. She stopped herself. Did not realize what? I asked gently. Emily looked down at the floor. Nothing. It is just, she kept saying she was trying to make everything more professional. Professional. The same word Pamela had used repeatedly throughout the planning process. Suddenly many pieces began fitting together. Emily reached for my hand. Grandma, if this hurt you, I am so sorry. I truly did not know. Looking into her eyes, I saw the little girl who used to bake cookies in my kitchen. Whatever mistakes had been made, they did not begin with her. That realization brought relief but also concern. Because if Emily had not known, then Pamela had been operating with far more control than anyone realized. As we returned toward the ballroom, Emily squeezed my hand once more. After the honeymoon, I want to sit down and talk about everything, she said. I nodded. I think that would be a good idea. When we re-entered the reception, I noticed Pamela watching us from across the room. Her smile remained perfectly polished. Yet for the first time all evening, I thought I detected something else behind it. Uncertainty. Because whether she knew it or not, the version of the story she had carefully managed all year was beginning to unravel. The wedding ended shortly after midnight. Guests departed carrying favors and photographs, unaware that my attention was no longer focused on the celebration itself. It was focused on understanding how so many decisions had been made without the knowledge of the people they supposedly benefited. The following week, I returned home and tried to resume my normal routine. I watered my garden. I attended church on Sunday. I met friends for coffee. Yet the questions from that evening never left me. 3 days later, Martin called and asked whether he could stop by. When he arrived, he carried a folder under his arm. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Emily and I had planned so much of the wedding together. Martin opened the folder carefully. Before I show you this, he said, I need you to understand something. I did not go looking for trouble. Trouble found me. I listened quietly. Martin explained that one of the event vendors was a longtime client of his accounting firm. During a casual conversation after the wedding, the seating chart incident came up. The vendor had assumed everyone already knew about the last-minute changes. My stomach tightened. What changes? I asked. Martin slid several printed emails across the table. These. I adjusted my glasses and began reading. The first email came from Pamela. It had been sent 6 weeks before the wedding. In it, she instructed the coordinator to move several family members to different tables. Another message specifically requested that all references to me be changed from grandmother of the bride to wedding sponsor. My eyes moved slowly across the page. There it was in black and white. No misunderstanding. No accident. No clerical error. A deliberate instruction. Another email requested that the family table be reserved only for immediate participants. My assigned seat was moved farther back during the same revision. A third message referred to maintaining a professional image and reducing what Pamela described as unnecessary emotional emphasis. I set the papers down. The room felt very quiet. Martin waited patiently while I absorbed what I had read. Surprisingly, I did not feel angry. Not in the way people might expect. Anger burns hot and fast. What I felt was colder. Clearer. Like finally seeing a landscape after a fog lifts. For months I had doubted my instincts. I had questioned my memory. I had searched for innocent explanations. Those emails removed every uncertainty. Does Emily know? Martin asked gently. I shook my head. I do not think so. He nodded. That was my impression as well. We spent another hour reviewing the correspondence. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Pamela had gradually taken control of communications with vendors, coordinators, and planners. More importantly, she often acted without informing anyone else. Each individual change seemed minor. Together they told a very different story. By the time Martin left, the folder remained on my kitchen table. I stared at it for a long time. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the yard. Birds moved through the trees. Everything looked ordinary. Yet something important had changed. 2 days before the wedding, I received an unexpected delivery. A small box from Emily's apartment containing what appeared to be discarded papers. Inside were text message printouts, screenshots of late-night conversations between Emily and Pamela. One message stood out: just tell her you decided the seating arrangement would look more professional with sponsor listed. Another read: she won't say anything, she wants us to win. The messages showed Emily feeling guilty about letting Pamela take control, even writing herself notes like, I'm sorry I let this happen, and I just want everything perfect for everyone. These weren't vendor emails, these were her own words, showing the pattern had been accepted by both daughters-in-law long before Emily learned she'd been deceived. Martin nodded when I showed him. Now we know it wasn't isolated control. It was complicity. I opened another folder Martin had brought. Inside were 2 more printouts, emails from Emily herself sent 3 months before the wedding. The first instructed the coordinator to update the guest list with Pamela's suggestions. The second approved budget increases for professional image enhancements without questioning them. A third showed her approving the venue change that pushed family closer and business contacts further away. These weren't vendor emails, these were Emily's own approvals, dated weeks before she supposedly discovered Pamela's control. For the first time since the wedding, I was no longer searching for answers. I had them. The real question now was what to do with the truth. Because hidden inside my desk was information Pamela knew nothing about. Information connected to a decision I had postponed until after the wedding. A decision involving Emily's future. And as I looked once more at the email spread across my table, I realized that before any final choice was made, there were still a few conversations that needed to happen. 2 weeks after the wedding, Emily returned from her honeymoon and called me exactly as she had promised. Her voice sounded different from the excited bride I had seen at the reception. It carried a seriousness that told me she had been thinking about our conversation the entire trip. We agreed to meet at my house the following Saturday afternoon. The morning of our meeting, I placed the folder Martin had given me on the dining room table. Beside it sat another folder, one nobody else knew about. I had prepared it months before the wedding. At the time, it represented one of the happiest decisions of my life. Now it represented something far more complicated. Emily arrived shortly after noon. She hugged me tightly and immediately sensed the weight in the room. We sat down together, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, I handed her the first folder. I think you need to see these, I said quietly. She opened it and began reading. The room grew silent except for the occasional turning of paper. I watched her expression change page by page. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became disappointment. By the time she reached the final email, tears had formed in her eyes. I had no idea, she whispered. I swear to you, Grandma. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I know. That simple statement seemed to break something loose inside her. For the next hour, Emily told me things she had never fully admitted before. She explained how Pamela had gradually taken control of the wedding planning. How every disagreement became an argument about efficiency. How concerns were dismissed as emotional overreactions. Emily confessed that she often felt pushed aside during her own wedding preparations but convinced herself it was easier to let Pamela handle things. Listening to her, I realized that manipulation rarely affects only one person. It spreads quietly through families, convincing everyone that keeping the peace is more important than asking difficult questions. When our conversation finally ended, I slid the second folder across the table. Emily looked at it curiously. "What is this?" she asked. I smiled sadly. "Something I intended to give you after the wedding." She opened it slowly. Inside were documents establishing a trust fund. Years earlier, my late husband and I had set aside money specifically for future generations. Over time, the account had grown substantially. The trust would have helped Emily purchase a home, continue her education if she wished, or build a secure future. Her eyes widened as she reviewed the papers. "Grandma," she began. I gently raised my hand. "Please let me finish." She nodded. I explained that I had delayed activating the trust until after the wedding because I wanted the celebration to be about family, not money. I wanted people to reveal who they truly were before financial decisions entered the picture. Emily sat quietly, absorbing every word. "Are you saying Pamela knew about this?" she asked. "No," I replied. "She never knew. That is what makes everything so revealing." Emily stared down at the documents. "Then why are you showing me this now?" I leaned back in my chair. Outside the window, sunlight filtered through the trees my husband had planted decades earlier. "Because this trust was never about rewarding good behavior," I said softly. "It was about protecting someone I love. And before I make any final decisions, I wanted to know whether the young woman sitting across from me was still the same granddaughter who once cared more about people than appearances." Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks. She stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around me. In that moment, I finally understood something important. The wedding had revealed far more than Pamela's intentions. It had revealed who Emily truly was. And that realization would shape everything that happened next. Over the next month, several conversations took place that should have happened long before the wedding. Emily spoke with her husband. She spoke with her father. Eventually, she spoke with Pamela. I was not present for those discussions, nor did I ask for details. Some matters belonged to the people directly involved. What mattered to me was what happened afterward. For the first time in years, actions began matching words. Emily called her own father that Friday evening and told him what she'd learned. "I need you to understand," she said, "what happened at my wedding wasn't stress, it was manipulation." He listened in silence before calling Pamela later that day. The conversation must have gone poorly. The next morning, Richard visited me with a different expression than before. "Pamela's reputation among the extended family has taken a serious hit," he admitted. "People who praised her coordination are now questioning her motives." Her confidence slowly disappeared once she lost control of the narrative. A few weeks later, Richard came to see me. He looked older than I remembered. Regret has a way of doing that. We sat at the same kitchen table where so many important conversations had happened. He apologized. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. Simply an apology. He admitted that he had ignored warning signs because it felt easier than asking difficult questions. I appreciated his honesty. Relationships are not repaired by pretending mistakes never happened. They are repaired when people finally accept responsibility for them. As for Pamela, things became noticeably quieter. The confidence I had seen at the wedding slowly disappeared once her decisions could no longer hide behind carefully managed narratives. She never offered the dramatic confrontation some people might expect. In truth, I did not want one. I had reached an age where peace mattered more than victory. The emails had already spoken for themselves. The wedding had already revealed what needed to be revealed. Nothing would be gained by turning pain into a public spectacle. Several months later, Emily returned to my home once again. This time, we met with attorneys and finalized the trust documents. The decision was not based on guilt. It was not a reward for taking my side. It was based on character. Emily had chosen accountability when denial would have been easier. She had chosen honesty when silence would have been more comfortable. Most importantly, she had chosen family. After everything was signed, she asked me a question I will never forget. "Grandma, after all of this, what hurt you the most?" I thought about it carefully. It was not the seating chart. It was not the table assignment. It was not even the word sponsor printed beside my name. Those were only symptoms. What hurt me most, I told her, was believing that people saw my value only through what I could provide instead of who I was. Emily nodded slowly. Tears filled her eyes again. Then she smiled and took my hand. "I see you," she said quietly. Years have passed since then. The wedding photographs still sit on a shelf in my living room. Visitors sometimes ask about the beautiful celebration. I smile and tell them it was unforgettable. And that is true. Not because of the flowers. Not because of the ballroom. Not because of the money spent. It was unforgettable because it taught me something important, and for Pamela, the lesson came with consequences. Her reputation among extended family crumbled. People who praised her coordination began questioning why she made decisions nobody understood. She never regained the influence she once held. The people who truly love you never reduce you to a role. They never measure your worth by your usefulness. They see your heart long before they see your contribution. On that wedding day, I arrived believing I was helping create a future for someone I loved. In the end, I discovered something even more valuable. I discovered exactly who belonged in mine.